anyone who's a newer yoga teacher, if you're like, what's one thing that I could do today to grow my following or turn the dial on my career? Like, go try to hear like 5 to 10 no's today. Because if you aren't hearing no, you are not trying your hardest, in my opinion.
Welcome back to Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast. My name is Reka, and I hope you're having a good day as you listen to this episode. So if you are new to this podcast, welcome. I'm happy you are here. If you are a returning listener, welcome back. I'm so happy and grateful that you listen to this podcast every week. So if you're new, this podcast, Full-Time Yoga Teacher Podcast, started because when I first became a yoga teacher, I wanted to try this as a full-time thing. I wanted to see if it was possible to be a full-time yoga teacher and let this be my main job, income, and also my passion and my lifestyle. It's all at the same time. Since there wasn't a lot of people I could speak to about whether being a full-time yoga teacher is possible or not, how many classes do I have to take? Is there a specific path I need to follow or take to become a successful full-time yoga teacher? So I just started asking a lot of questions to whoever I could. It was hard to get the full picture of what it's like to be a full-time yoga teacher because everybody had different stories. Not everyone was full-time. And also, I think being a full-time yoga teacher is a somewhat newer career path. So that's kind of why I started this podcast. Now I teach yoga full-time. It's been almost 9 years, and I also mentor new yoga teachers. And I get asked a lot, how do I do it? How is it possible that I've been teaching yoga full-time for this long and love it, love doing it, So that's why I started this podcast, so I can not only share my story of being a full-time yoga teacher, but also interview and share other full-time yoga teachers' stories of how they have made it this far. What were some challenges that they came across, challenges they overcame, and what are some tips that they learned along the way that they could share with the listeners. So I hope you're enjoying this podcast. I am enjoying producing it every week. I do have a few housekeeping before I get into this week's podcast episode. Some of you who follow me on Instagram knows that I started a marathon training. I am running a marathon with my sister in February of 2025. I thought I would never run a full marathon. I've run a handful of half marathons, and there was a time in my life I was really into running, but around the time I became a yoga teacher, I was no longer really interested in running anymore, so I kind of stopped running long distances. And I thought I would never run a full marathon, and I was completely fine with that. But my sister asked me to run a marathon with her, and I couldn't say no. So here I am, training for a full marathon and trying to juggle my work as a full-time yoga teacher and my personal life and everything all together. So if you want to follow me along on training for the full marathon, you can watch my Instagram. I'm trying to produce one reel each week that updates you on my weekly marathon training. So another fun update, I just came back from Mexico. I went to go visit my best friend in Mexico, Puerto Vallarta, for the weekend. And it was so nice to catch up with her and spend really quality time with her. So my heart is really full and so grateful that I have such amazing people in my life. And as I get older, what I'm reminded of every year, every moment is to really value your loved ones, whether that's your family, friends, partner, even if you don't get to see them all the time, if they live across the globe or different states, different countries, really making time to see them, catch up with them, spend quality time with them is priceless. And that is something I really strive to do in my life, is keep in touch and stay connected, make effort to stay connected with the people I love. One more announcement I would like to make is that next week's episode is episode 40. And as you know, every 10th episode, I release solo episode where I talk about whatever topic I want to talk about rather than interviewing someone else. And someone have recommended or requested that I do a Q&A episode. So send me your questions. It could be questions about my life, my teaching career, or maybe not even related to yoga. If you have any questions for me that's not related to yoga, please send me your questions. You can send me your questions to my Instagram, which is @ReikaYoga. You can also send me a message through my homepage or my website through contact page. And my website is www.reikayoga.com. And I would love to hear some questions from you, get some questions from you that I could answer in my next solo episode. Before I get started on today's interview, I do want to mention that this interview was recorded when I was still living in Peru. And I remember this day very clearly. I was in town of Chachapoya, beautiful, cute little town. But my hostel that I was staying, internet just stopped working randomly. The hostel owners couldn't do anything about it. Internet completely gone. So I had to walk to a nearest coffee shop and ask the coffee shop owner, is it okay if I use the internet for a few hours to do this Zoom call to interview someone? And they were very kind to say yes, of course. And they gave me a back room to interview, to be on the Zoom call. But the back room, there was a lot of workers coming in and out of this back room. So just to warn you and let you know that in this interview that I'm going to share with you that I did with Kelly, you're going to hear a lot of background noises whenever I'm speaking. I try to mute myself as much as possible when Kelly's speaking. But when I'm speaking, you will hear some background noises, and I hope you can still understand what I'm talking about. That's kind of life of traveling and producing podcasts. Sometimes you just have to adapt, be flexible, go find a coffee shop with good Wi-Fi and do your podcast interview there. So that is a warning I wanted to give you before this podcast. So Kelly reached out to me to be interviewed for this podcast. And when I found out a little bit more about her, I was very thrilled. So I never met her in person, but I really enjoyed having this conversation with her. And also, I really loved hearing her journey because she really created this amazing business by herself. And she is a go-getter. She worked really hard to build what she have right now. And I have a huge respect for her. Hearing her stories of her journey was really inspiring. And knowing that she is also a podcaster was really cool to speak to her and hear her experience about podcasting and some challenges and some celebrations that she was able to experience from podcasting to grow her business. We also got to speak about how to balance being a full-time yoga teacher and having a family. Kelly has 2 kids, and she also shares challenges that she have trying to balance business and being a mom, as well as a beautiful part of being a mom and also having her own business. So I think her stories brings a really interesting perspective and different perspectives than maybe other podcast interviews where I didn't really ask too many questions about how to balance having a family and being a full-time yoga teacher. And I got to ask a lot of those questions with Kelly, and Kelly was gracious enough to share amazing tips as well as just a true, honest experience of trying to balance both. So I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Kelly. Kelly Smith is a global yoga and meditation teacher, author, founder of Yoga for You, and the host of the iTunes chart-topping podcast, Mindful in Minutes, and Meditation Mama. Kelly believes that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to yoga and meditation, and encourages her students to find their own personal practice, listen to their bodies, and find inner joy by accessing their most authentic selves. Kelly is best known for her guided meditation, Yoga Nidra, and restorative yoga practices that she has been sharing since 2016 on her podcast and in her best-selling books. So here's a conversation I had with Kelly. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll speak to you on the other side. Welcome, Kelly, for coming to join me on the Full-Time Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm so excited that I get to have this opportunity to chat with you. So how are you doing today?
I am doing so well. I'm so excited to be here and to get to chat with another yoga teacher about the thing that we love.
Yeah, me too. Maybe tell the listener, where are you logging in from today?
So I'm joining from Minneapolis, Minnesota. So good old Midwest.
And is that where you're from?
It is. I consider it home. We moved here when I was young, so I've been here for the bulk of my life. So it's where I grew up, but I was born in Virginia. And then in my adult life, I've lived in Minnesota twice. So we've moved a lot for my husband's work. So we were in Minnesota the first time. That's where we met. And then we lived in Missouri for a little bit, and then Michigan for a little bit, and then Minnesota, because the universe only sends me apparently to like states.
So I've never been. How's the weather like now in the summertime?
I think it is hot, but I don't do well in the heat. But it's like, I think today's a little bit cooler. I think it's going to be a high of maybe like 80, but rarely does it get hot, like above the 90s here in the summer. But we have really beautiful summers. But I think in Minnesota in particular, like fall is the perfect season because you get that like quintessential, like cool weather. You can wear your sweaters. It's cold enough. The leaves change. It's like we have the most beautiful falls, but I get very hot very quick. So summer anywhere is not really my favorite.
That's interesting because most people I speak to, they love the hot summer, and they usually will try to get away from cold locations and like move to warmer place for the summer.
Yes, I would do the opposite. We just did a family vacation to Scotland, and I was like, oh, thank God it'll be like colder there. And they actually had a little bit of a heat wave. And I was like, I just can't escape this heat.
Scotland sounds amazing though. I've never been there. Tell me a little bit about how you got introduced to yoga.
So I started doing it when I was really young. So I'm in my 30s. So when I say really young, that would be like the early 2000s. And it definitely wasn't cool at that time. So I remember my mom had to like drive me to my yoga class. I was doing it as a form of cross training for my sports. I was an athlete through college. And I was there for like the good stretch. And it's kind of funny now because my favorite styles to teach are restorative yoga, yoga nidra, and then I focus primarily on meditation. But when I was younger, I was so antsy and I was a Shavasana skipper. And it is, something, I'm a reformed Shavasana skipper. But I remember just being there for quote, like the good stretch and then like leaving and really having no concept at all of like the significance of Shavasana or like the importance of slowing down or anything like that. A really vigorous like vinyasa for a while. And then when I was 16, my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer and my whole world turned upside down. And my mom was doing some yoga with me and, a really long journey with that. She's in remission. So this has a happy ending. She's now Grammy to my kids, but we started doing some gentler practices and I didn't know it at the time, but we started doing a little more like meditation and like visualization and things like that. And that's when my eyes really opened to sort of more the softer side of yoga and mindfulness and meditation, and things have kind of changed and transformed then. But I definitely just got into it for a good stretch for cross training for my sports, which I imagine you have probably heard, and a lot of your listeners hear from your students, is they come to their first yoga class because they're like, oh, I want to quote stretch.
Yeah. What sports were you playing when you were growing up?
I played primarily volleyball and softball. Softball is the one that brought me through part of college. And then I played volleyball through high school. So I was always like a sporty gal. And then about halfway through college, I kind of decided that I didn't have any desire to be like a professional athlete. And so I felt like the time commitment and the effort that I was putting into the sport of softball at that time just wasn't necessarily the direction that I wanted to go. So then I ended up walking away from that like halfway through college. And that is when I really had always been practicing yoga, but I was feeling a little bit lost. And I didn't necessarily feel like college was my place to thrive because I also have both ADHD and dyslexia. And so, like, a traditional schooling system isn't always like the best place for me to kind of be set up for success. And there was this yoga studio there called Heartworks Yoga Studio in the small town I was going to college. And I started going and taking classes all the time. It was such a great studio. And when I graduated college, I, like many, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I took a 200-hour yoga teacher training.
I love that story. And, I was also sporty when I was growing up. I played basketball for quite some time. And I noticed that once I started entering in the yoga world and started really getting into yoga, a lot of people, especially yoga teachers, have dance background or gymnastic background. And I really felt like my body type didn't fit in that world. I was much tighter than everyone else, and I wasn't moving as gracefully as everybody else. And I wonder if you had a similar experience, or were you flexible from the beginning, or did you have a difficult time coming from the sports background in the beginning?
I didn't have a hard time coming from sports to yoga, but I did struggle because I was so much younger than everyone else. So, like, in the early 2000s, it was not like, it was definitely not what it is today to like be kind of like a wellness girly and to be into yoga and meditation and mindfulness and journaling and all of that. It was really seen as kind of weird. And not only from like the kids that were my age, and they'd be like, oh, you're going to like a yoga class. Okay. But also I was so much younger than all the other students in class. I feel like maybe it was just my area, but a lot of the students at the time were kind of like my mom's age, and I was like the kid in class. And then when I started teaching in my early 20s, I was so much younger than all of my students. And I had a hard time at first with some imposter syndrome and being like, what do I really have to share? Like, all of my students have kids my age, and here I am trying to like teach them something. And I think that was a lot harder for me, was just that I was always so much younger. And now if you go to a yoga class or even go on like a meditation retreat, and like I lead those now, and I feel like a lot of the people who come to these experiences are younger than me now, and so much younger than people used to be when they came to yoga. But I think that was my biggest struggle, or where I felt really like a fish out of water, was like I was just so much younger than everyone else.
That's so interesting to hear, because nowadays, teacher trainings are full of, I think, more even younger crowd. I feel like people in their 20s, and now even teenagers are going through 200 hours. So that's so interesting. But definitely, I have felt like that before, where what can I share when I'm half of their age? They have way more wisdom than I do. So yeah, I do remember feeling like that in some part of my teaching career. And I remember thinking like I can teach what I know, and remembering that, trying not to be somebody else. I used to have a thing where like I felt like I have to give a Dharma talk or philosophical talk in every single yoga asana class I taught. And there used to be this pressure that I felt like I had to. And when I felt like I had to, I was almost forcing it out of me. And I think a couple of my teachers that I really respect, I remember them telling me that you don't have to do Dharma talk if you don't want to. You don't have to do it every class. And that took a lot of pressure off of me. And I remember just like, okay, I can just teach what I know, what I feel like I can do well, and the rest will come later. And I remember that gave me kind of like a permission to be like, okay, I don't have to be this like spiritual, wise teacher every single class that I'm teaching, especially if I'm teaching somebody so much older and wiser than I am,
No, I think that's so insightful. And I always say there's a student for every teacher and a teacher for every student. Like, not every student and every teacher are meant for one another. And I think we all have something to share regardless of age or skill level. Like my kids who are 3 and, a few months old, like they teach me things all the time, and they've only been alive for not that long. And we all have something to share. I think it's really just about, sharing what's real and authentic, like on your heart, and it's going to resonate with people. And I think, especially as yoga teachers, like the one thing that you can't really teach someone is like authenticity and passion. And I think when you have that, the rest will fall into place. But like, it's so magnetic when you just see a teacher who's so authentic and willing to stand in their light and share what they love, and students come.
Yeah, so true. And I think we can tell from students can tell, and I can tell when I'm taking someone's class, when teachers are, if they're being authentic. And you can also tell when they're almost trying too hard or trying to be somebody else. So I think it's so important to just be who you are and just come from that authenticity, like you said. So I know you took your 200 hours, and after 200 hours, did you start teaching right away, or did you have another career outside of that that you were slowly transitioning into teaching yoga?
I did a little bit of both. So I did have a full-time career. I worked in management. And because I had this hard time after I did my 200-hour, my heart was being pulled to yoga, but my mind was saying that, like, that's not a quote real job. And I felt like at the time, I was just graduating. I took it the summer right after I graduated, and everyone, was kind of like, oh, I got this job, I got that job, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And people are kind of, one-upping one another as to who got like the best job out of college. And I just that didn't resonate with me. And I was just feeling pulled in a different direction. But I was honestly really scared to pursue what my heart was telling me to do because I was so worried about what other people would think. And I ended up, my mom is such a big supporter of me. And I remember we were driving in the car and I was like, oh, Mom, like, I don't know what I want to do when I graduate, but, I kind of feel like I want to teach yoga and I want to take a yoga teacher training. And I just remember such like a profound moment. And she and I just spoke about this moment like a couple of days ago, because I was like, Mom, remember that time we were driving in the car and I said I thought I wanted to teach yoga? And her response was, if that's what your heart feels like it should do, you should do it. And I just was like, you may not have realized it in the moment, but like that was such a pivotal moment for me, hearing that like someone that I respected and loved so much not only believed in me, but was like, that's an okay thing to do. And I feel like when you're following a dream or you're pursuing a path that is not traditional, even having like one person in your corner and saying like, I think you should do it and I believe that you can do it is so important and special. And so she and I were just talking about that just the other day. Because I think too, sometimes as parents, like you say things, and my kids are little, but I'm sure I'll say things or do things for better and for worse that will stick with them well beyond, like, to me, it might just seem like a simple moment and I may forget it like an instant later, but there's just some things that we do as parents that stick with our kids for a really long time. And that was something that has always stuck with me, was that moment in the car with my mom, where I felt like I was like admitting something kind of shameful. I was like, I don't know if I want to pursue anything like with my degree. I just want to teach yoga. And she was like, if your heart pushes you in that direction, like you should do it. And that was so important and special to me. And her, voice has always kind of been in the back of my head of like, even when other people don't believe in it, because I really didn't have a lot of people that thought what I was doing was a good idea. But she did. And that's kind of all I needed. It was like even one person to be like, no, I think you can do it.
So amazing that how supportive your mom was during that time. Because it matters, right? Like people you care about or people who's closest to you in your life, whether they support your decision or, support the path that you decide to take your career into. And like, I think full-time yoga teaching is not very common or conventional way of choosing our career path. So it's so nice when somebody can be very supportive in that way. I remember I had, my family and friends were quite supportive because I always kind of had a very unconventional jobs. But I do remember my partner at the time wasn't very supportive at all. And he would tell me things like, when are you going to get a real job? Or that's not the real career path to pursue. And it really like it feels restricting when somebody so close to you aren't very supportive. So I'm so glad to hear that your mom was still supportive and that kind of gave you the permission to continue on that path.
Yeah, no, I'm very fortunate for that. And I had a similar experience. I remember at my wedding, there was an individual at my wedding. We were going around and thanking everyone, being like, oh, thank you so much for coming. And this is when I had just kind of started Yoga for You, which is, now my kind of location independent yoga meditation school. And this individual came up and just like gave me this hug, was like, oh, congratulations. But I just have to tell you, you really should try to do more with your life. I don't know why she felt like this was the moment to tell me this at my own wedding, but she's like, you really need to try to do more with your life than, just this yoga thing. And buying your time until my husband is doctor recently. And she's like, oh, just, is this what you're doing until you can be a doctor's wife? And she said, go do something with your life, get a master's, go be the kind of woman that will make other women proud. And I was just like, that's an interesting thing to say at someone's wedding. But I just remembered there was a lot of that sentiment at that time, was that my choice to follow my dream was like wasting my time or like beneath me in a way. And that always made me feel so sad, because now in hindsight, if I think about my children or like my loved ones, like nothing makes me happier than to see other people happy and like fulfilled in what they do, whatever that is. And I think that it's just such a beautiful thing to see other people pursuing dreams and, you know, thriving and doing what they love. And it always made me feel really sad when other people didn't feel that way.
Yeah. I can't imagine somebody telling you that on your wedding day. That is very impactful. I feel like, you know, like even small comments I've received in the past is quite impactful. And on your wedding day, yeah, definitely. But I think, I don't know your story too well, but I listened to your podcast about it. But it seems like you were able to really create this amazing career path that a lot of yoga teachers right now would dream of. So I think it's so great that you really followed your heart and really continued on. And I want to ask a little bit about how you went from having a full-time job to becoming a full-time teacher. What was that transition like in your journey?
So my husband, at the time boyfriend, when we moved to Missouri, it was for his medical school. And I had to leave my job because we moved to basically this like one bar, one Walmart town. So there's no option of like transferring or anything like that. So I found myself in this small town. I didn't know anyone. I was unemployed. I had just been teaching yoga on the side, just, you know, subbing classes here and there, getting my toes wet, dreaming of doing that, but then having my other job, my quote, real job. And so I just found myself not really knowing what to do, because my husband, my partner, was always in school and I had no friends. And I was just like, it was just me and my dog, because that was the deal. I was like, I'll move to Missouri, but I need a dog. I need a little furry friend, a buddy, and with nothing to do. So I was like, okay. I had a few days of kind of like a pity party. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to try to make this yoga thing work. And I figured the universe had kind of given me this clean slate, and there wasn't a ton of opportunity for jobs there. And we were single income now that my husband was back in school. So I started reaching out to like his medical school, and I started teaching some classes there and then working odd jobs on the side. So I nannied, I quote managed a gym, which was like cleaning the bathrooms and folding like sweat towels for people and like unlocking the doors. I did all sorts of like random jobs to pay the bills. And then I was slowly growing my yoga business on the side and teaching different classes. And then that would grow and that would grow. And I eventually ended up opening a yoga studio in that town. And that was the first kind of yoga for you, was then this studio. And it was such a special time for me. And I ended up, you know, running that studio, teaching there, doing some teacher trainings there. But I knew that we would be leaving. And so after about a year and a half, I had to sell the studio, and then we moved to Michigan. And that is when I went completely location independent, because anyone who has spent so much time and effort, any teacher kind of building their following, like it's tough to get people in those classes and to really build your following as a teacher. And then when you move and you start all over again, it's just so tough. And I knew we were only going to be in Michigan for like a year and a half. And so I was like, I don't want to start all over, because I feel like it really takes a solid like 1 to 3 years to really establish yourself as a yoga teacher and like build a name for yourself, in my opinion, in a new location. So I went completely location independent. It was about 7 years ago. And that's when I started the podcast. And I started traveling and doing pop-up continued ed training. So I trained in restorative yoga, yoga nidra, and meditation. And so I would go around all over globally and do these pop-up trainings for continued ed for teachers who wanted to learn these specific modalities. And then I could go to any studio and teach something in like a weekend and then go home. And then I was also teaching classes on the side, and I started doing retreats. So that's when I decided I was going to fully location independent. And I've never had like a physical location since. And it's been really great and really fulfilling and gives me a lot of freedom as life changes. So we moved again. And then, of course, COVID changed everything. We all just had to figure out how to be location independent. And then when I started having kids, that changed everything as well. So it's given me the flexibility I didn't even realize I would need in the future.
Such an amazing story because, well, first of all, I think it's so amazing that you started or you owned a studio in that small town that you initially moved to. And were your yoga studio the only yoga studio in that town?
It was. There were a couple other people like teaching some classes here and there, but there was not like a true like designated base. And so it was really special to be able to, and this is something that I know many studio owners won't have this experience because there are a lot of yoga studios. But it was really cool to be able to kind of create the blueprint for having like a yoga space. And when I moved there, this would have been almost 10 years ago. So it would have been 10 years ago. And not only was it like a one bar, one Walmart town in Missouri, but a lot of people were resistant to yoga. They believed it was against their religious beliefs. And they had a lot of preconceived notions as to what like yoga was. And it was challenging for me, but it was also really good for me as a teacher because I believe it's our job as a teacher to meet our students where they're at. And so that's when I started teaching. I don't really teach in Sanskrit. I started teaching just like using kind of the English pose names and things like that to help share yoga in a way that made people feel more comfortable, because I find that a lot of times people won't come to yoga because there can be sort of a high barrier to entry, whether it be like a financial barrier to entry, or, it can feel like a religious barrier to entry, or there's just some misunderstandings as to what the practice is, its origins, all of that. And so it really challenged me to open my mind as to how I can become a better teacher, to still share such a transformative practice, but in a way that didn't feel upsetting or off-putting or isolating to my students.
Yeah, it's so true. Depending on the community or the student base you have or the location where you're teaching it to, it's so important for us teachers to be able to kind of read the room and think about how can I bring in and how can I offer this beautiful practice of yoga in a way that they can relate to. And sometimes bringing in yoga sutras or Gita philosophy might not be the right place, although you can bring maybe the same concept or same message, but teaching in a different way that anybody can relate from different spiritual background. So that's so amazing that you started a studio in that small town. And I know you said you worked so hard to build this community, and when you had to move again, you decided to make your offering or your yoga teaching location independent. So before I want to ask all about how you made your yoga teaching location independent, because that's something I think a lot of people are interested in or would love to hear, myself included. But how do you think you were able to build communities and some following in that small town with your yoga studio before you had to move away?
I really appreciate that question. I think a lot of it was just being myself and trying to keep an open door and an open heart to those who wanted to come and learn. So I'm an open book. If, people wanted to, I also really hustled. And so there was, I would teach anyone and everyone. For example, when the public library said, hey, we're working on our kids' summer programming. Would you be willing to teach like a kids yoga class? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. I did a lot of things for free, which I don't always recommend doing. Sometimes we have to do it as we're building our following. I probably did too much of it, but I did do, community yoga classes. I had a handful of students where I did teach this regular kids yoga class at the local library. It was called Yoga Bears. And I remember this was one of those instances where I was told I couldn't use the word meditation. I had brought a book called Peaceful Piggy Meditation. And it was part of the class that I was going to teach, just like this 30-minute class. And I was told that I could not use the word meditation because it was offensive and against the religious beliefs of the organizer. And so I was just, like I said, there really wasn't anyone that I wouldn't teach. I was like, okay, I can't use the word meditation. No problem. We are going to work on quieting our minds, and we're going to do some intentional breathing. And so I just was like, okay, fine. If I can't call it meditation, I'll call it what it is, which is single pointed concentration. And we can, we don't have to read Peaceful Piggy Meditation, but we can do some fun little games and activities and things like that, where it, teaches the same foundation, and then people will start feeling better and, all of that. So I really just didn't say no to anything for like a year. And I asked anyone and everyone who would let me. Any business that was there, I was like, hey, would you ever want like a lunch hour yoga class? My husband's med school is very open. They had kind of like a fitness center. So they were really open to like having some kind of group programming. So if a class started doing really well, it was really full. I was like, hey, have you noticed that like the Friday 5:30 p.m. class is doing really well? What do you think about adding like a 4:30 p.m.? We could do like back to back. I just was so like shameless and put myself out there and just started teaching in the way that felt good and authentic to me. I did a lot of extra training during this time. I started pursuing meditation, learning more about it. There was a time where I like went to Southern Missouri and stayed with some monks for a while to learn like their style meditation. I went to Bali for like 6 weeks to do a 300-hour teacher training. And I just kept bringing like new things, trying different things, and just keeping an open door and an open heart to anyone who wanted to walk through into my space, whether it be my actual yoga studio or before that, other pop-up classes and doing free classes, community building things. And then word of mouth is always going to be your friend. So I would do fun things where I'd be like, oh, it's bring a friend to class week. So anyone who comes to class, you can bring a friend for free because it's more fun to do yoga with friends. And I would just try anything and just not be afraid to hear no or to get rejected or to, be cringy or whatever. I just kind of went for it full speed and persistence pays off.
I love to hear that. I think it is important to say yes to many things, especially when you're newer in teaching or when you're living in a small town like you were, that not many people knew about yoga, or there wasn't like, pre-existing job for you, like in a bigger city, there's so many yoga studios. Every single gym offers yoga classes, but for you, you really have to kind of go out there and create that opportunity for yourself. And I really admire that. And I know, so when you have to move, you have to bring your followings with you when you move to your more like online offerings. So during the time when you were teaching a lot in person, were you collecting email addresses, or how were you able to kind of shift from in-person teaching that you were doing? And when you have to move to make everything, not everything, but a lot of it into more location independent, so online offering, were you collecting email addresses? Did you have a newsletter? How were you able to make that shift?
I really didn't, in hindsight, I didn't really do it that well. I would do it differently now, but also there's way better tools to be able to do this now, to go virtual or location independent, to collect email addresses, things like that. I had this like Facebook page because again, 8 years ago, it was still like, Facebook was the hot thing at like communicating with people. I had like a Facebook page. I did collect some emails. And this was when I started my podcast, because I had kind of started to develop the signature style where I do a few minutes of like guided meditation or guided imagery and shavasana at the end of my classes. And I wanted to continue to share that with my students, which is when I started Mindful in Minutes, my podcast, which is mostly just recorded guided meditations. And I started it and shared on social media, on Facebook, with the few emails that I had. And because I wanted to continue to share that with my students, but I really did not do a very savvy like rollout of, okay, now everything's going to be location independent. I was kind of just flying by the seat of my pants and trying to, keep the small community that I had. And it's funny because at that time, like the toughest part about podcasting is people didn't know what a podcast was. They were like, what is a podcast? How do I listen to it? Like people were really confused as to how to do that. So I had to do a lot of like podcast, like tech support to get people to listen. And then I tried to do a little bit more like hustling and trying to do like some cross promotion. I remember like even emailing a lot of like brands or things like Daily Om, things like that, being like, oh, would you ever want, a guided meditation, or, can I share something with your audience, and putting myself out there. But I really don't feel like I did a great job of transitioning my existing audience into like a super robust and flourishing new or like existing audience. I felt like I did kind of start from scratch, and I just started really putting myself out there and trying to make connections and sharing what I was doing with other people, posting on things like Yoga Trade, being like, hey, if anyone wants a pop-up meditation teacher training for their studio, like this is how I do it, like contact me for more information, and sort of just starting from square one, which is not how I would do it today, but it's how I did it 8 years ago, because there wasn't like, I think MailChimp existed, but it was like really clunky. It just wasn't that easy. There weren't that there wasn't really like a path forward where you could just a clear-cut path where you could say, okay, I do this, I set up my website, then I get an email list, then I'll do, social media content, and then maybe I'll end up creating some kind of a premium subscription. Like there was no clear-cut path for what I was doing. So I was kind of just flying by the seat of my pants. And it took a while, but I've always believed that building a business or following a dream is like building a house. And you have to kind of start with like the not so sexy stuff first, which is showing up every day and just laying bricks. Like we want to think about, we're building this house and what is it going to look like and the furniture we're going to put in it and, all of that, like the finished product. But the first thing you have to do is like, just show up every day and start laying bricks. And even to this day, when there's days, even though I feel so fortunate for what I'm doing and, every day I feel so grateful that the career that I have is the career that I have. But there's still days where I feel like, I'm tired or, I feel like I'm not turning the dial the way I'd like to. And I just remind myself I still have to show up and lay bricks. And so I did that really solidly for like 1 to 2 years. And then I started to, kind of see the dial turn.
Thank you for sharing that story of like, it wasn't easy. And obviously back then teaching online or, subscription, online studio, or even podcasts, like you said, weren't a huge thing. There were podcaster back then, but I don't think it's like much smaller and not many people actually knew about it. So I think it's so amazing you started during that time when there wasn't a lot of people doing what you're doing. And I think what I hear from many yoga teachers over and over again, how like consistency is so important. Like you just keep showing up, even though like, let's say you only have one student that show up that day or 2 students the next week, but just like consistency, you'll keep showing up and people will start to notice that or start to trust you that you are always showing up. So I really appreciate and feel very inspired by that because with my podcast too, I'm much newer to it and I'm like committed to like, okay, once a week, I'm going to produce no matter what. And even though I may not see like the result now, like I'm hoping that with just being consistent, something will happen. And I know you said that it was about a year or 2 of showing up consistently until you start to see you said the wheel start turning. So tell me about that. Like what started to shift that you started to realize like, okay, maybe these things I'm doing every week, every day is actually working.
Well, a few things that I do. And before I answer that, I just want to hold space for a minute for what you just shared, because I think for anyone who is starting a podcast or is newer in podcasting, like it is so much work. And I have so much respect for you and what you're doing and starting a podcast, especially like when there are some more out there, which doesn't mean that people shouldn't start podcasts. Like there's room for everyone, but anyone who hasn't started a podcast, we need to, send this podcast some love, leave a 5-star review, share with a friend, all of those things, because podcasting is so tough. It's so much work and it really does rely on like word of mouth. And so I have so much respect for you and like that dedication that you have and the commitment that you've made to yourself. So I just want to like hold space for that as well, because it is a lot of work. And I see that. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing to share all this beautiful content with us every week. Yeah. And then to answer your question, there's a few things that happened. A lot, I would say it was like 70% like dedication, showing up, laying bricks, and then 30% like luck in a way. So my life really changed. Everyone's life changed March 2020. But my professional life really changed for the better. And I didn't realize it. These things are doing really well. And my location independent model was a really travel heavy model. And March of 2020, I found out I was pregnant with my son. And then literally 5 days later, like the world shut down. And I remember I just had to clear basically my entire like 2020 calendar. And I remember thinking that was going to be the end of my business, as it was for many people. And many of us, thought that as well. As I thought, okay, well, I can't travel anymore. Also, I'm going to have this baby, pregnancy and all of that. We were really excited to be starting that new chapter, but I certainly couldn't be living like this really nomadic lifestyle that I was, being pregnant and also then having a newborn. And so I was, kind of having this panic moment. I had to cancel. I was doing a bunch of events like in the UK. And I remember one day I lost $12,000 and I I didn't know what we were going to do. We were still single income. It was just one of those moments where I was like, I think this is it. Like, I think this is the end of my bit. I don't know how I'll ever recuperate this. And then a week later, when lockdown happened, I remember my podcast numbers quadrupled the week that we all went in, because people were going in, they were freaking out, and they started looking for guided meditations, free guided meditations, things to help them with their stress and their anxiety. And my podcast, I mean, my life has never been the same. The podcast has never been the same since then. And I remember checking the numbers like 5 times, being like, is this a glitch? Is this raw? Like, are these numbers really right? And so I think because I had worked for 2 years to really create this foundation and kind of create this signature style with the practices that I was sharing, and just, my unique style with it, that then when people started looking for it, it was already there. There were 2 years worth of content. People started doubling down, starting a meditation practice, returning to a meditation practice, doubling down on a meditation practice. And that's the part where I was like, I really just felt like luck, where I was like, okay, I've been doing this thing, and then this once in a lifetime horrible thing happens, and then people just happen to start looking for what I was creating. And then when I saw that momentum starting to build, and I was just, at home and, sick and pregnant and all of that, I was like, okay, well, I never thought that the podcast would be the thing that would totally change my life. I thought it was going to be retreats really taking off, or trainings or things like that. And I thought, okay, well, the universe is sending me in this direction. So let's go, let's ride this wave, let's do it. And so I really started getting more serious about the podcast, and, trying to cross promote more, like share the meditation practices, get more engaged, like with my audience. That's when I started like monetizing my podcast as well. And everything really kind of changed. And then for the last like 5 years, the podcast has then been the biggest piece of like my location independent teaching, which I know is kind of a unique place to be in. But yeah, so it felt like 70% just like being determined and not giving up, and then 30% like a surprise lucky break.
So amazing to hear that. I mean, like you said, you put in the work, the foundation, the bricks. And I think that's why when the timing was right, it was able to like grow, right? Because you put in that work in the past couple of years. You said you were teaching, traveling and teaching in different studios before the pandemic happened, different trainings and workshops. How did you start about that? Were you having like a proposal that, hey, I teach this training, this many hours, and you were kind of proposing that to different studios all over the world and seeing who would actually invite you in? Or were you getting invites to come to teach, or how were you able to gain these kind of opportunities teaching in different locations, different countries?
It was a little bit of both. So I would share about different trainings I was doing, like on social media and things like that. And then some of my followers would be like, oh, I saw you just did a yoga nidra teacher training in Toronto. I have a studio, in Baltimore. Would you ever be interested in coming and doing something like that? So some of it was organic invites. But a lot of it was I posted on Yoga Trade. I also ran some Facebook ads, which I wasn't very savvy, and I was kind of just, trying, but saying like, I do these trainings, and I was doing kind of a split method where it was like $350 for someone to enroll in a weekend training at the time. And I would split, and the studio, if they just provided the space, I'd usually pay them like $100-ish, $150 per student that would join. And then I would keep the rest and, cover my own cost to get over there and things like that. And they would provide the space, and then, keep a portion of the training. But a lot of times it ended up being really beneficial for them as well, because then some of their teachers would take like yoga nidra or restorative yoga or meditation, and they could, or the studio owners could take it, and then they would have then this new modality to share like at their studio. And everyone knows, that for studio owners, like the real money makers are usually trainings and workshops, events, things like that. So I did post on Yoga Trade, and I got some people that were really interested. And again, I would kind of teach anywhere, even if it ended up meaning like breaking even on something as I was kind of getting my feet wet and really refining my trainings, getting comfortable leading them, and creating these 3 signature trainings. I found it to be really beneficial. And so some of it would be like organic, of people being like, hey, I saw you did this, or my friend recommended this training. I have a studio. What do you think about it? And then also either reaching out to studios that I liked. And I heard a lot of no's. Like anyone who's a newer yoga teacher, if you're like, what's one thing that I could do today to grow my following or turn the dial on my career? Like, go try to hear like 5 to 10 no's today. Because if you aren't hearing no, you are not trying your hardest, in my opinion. And whether that's like reaching out to a studio that you feel like, oh, I don't know, like, if the studio would ever invite me to audition, like just email them, ask them what their process is. Like, do things to try to get a no. It will help you, I promise. And so I did a lot of that too, of just kind of reaching out. And so it was a little bit of a mixture of the two. And then with anything, the more you do it, the easier it gets. So then you start building these relationships with studios, and you say, hey, like, last year it went really well. Would you want to do it again, this year? And so it kind of gets bigger and better as you do it and refine it and build those relationships with different studios.
Thank you for sharing that. It is so true that we just have to be okay with hearing no. We just have to sometimes we can't always wait for the opportunity to come. We really have to kind of get out there and create that opportunity or knock on doors and just like, hey, this is what I offer. And being okay with being told no. And I feel like I have many times been told no or never even gotten any responses back from a lot of emails or the request or proposal that I put in. So definitely, I think that's such a great advice. And so now that since the pandemic, you said everything became mostly virtual or online and not so much in person because of shift in obviously the pandemic as well as you having a baby. And with that transition, what is your different income streams now? I know you said that previous it was traveling and teaching plus some online. And now where are you at? And what kind of other offerings do you have that brings the different income streams into your career?
The biggest income stream I have right now is actually monetizing my podcast. So I do run ads on my podcast, which I know is interesting. When I first started doing it, it was like a lot of people weren't thrilled about it because they felt like if my heart was really in the right place, I would never monetize. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but you'd never monetize yoga or meditation if you really wanted to help people. And I have always set really firm boundaries with myself as to like the limit of how I monetize what I do. So it feels like my personal belief is that the work that we're doing, we should be paid for it. As yoga teachers, as meditation teachers, we should be compensated for that. My husband, is a doctor, and at least in the US, people, they don't show up and say, "Oh, doctor, I have pneumonia." And then, when they get a bill in the mail, they're like, "Wait, that doctor wants to get compensated." Like if he really cared about my health, he would work for free every single day. Like no one ever asked him to do that, to work for free. But yet I think sometimes when you're in the wellness space, yoga space, the spirituality space, people feel like, well, if you really care, you would just do it for free all the time. And that just wasn't an option. I had two options, which was either learn how to monetize what I'm already doing. And, we were single incomes. My whole family, we were going to have this baby. Everything relied on me getting the bills paid. My husband was still in school. And so it was either monetize what I'm doing or step away and get a different job. And I was really upfront with my audience about that. And I just run one ad before a meditation and people can skip it. But that's one of the biggest revenue streams that I have now is monetizing my podcast. I have it, all the places, but also like YouTube and, sharing some of my practices like on Insight Timer, or people can tip, things like that. That's one of my biggest revenue streams. And then I also have my signature trainings, which sometimes I will do virtually, like yoga nidra teacher training and restorative yoga teacher training. But then I have like my true signature training, which is my 40-hour meditation teacher training. That's done at your own pace. And that's something that I open enrollment up a few times a year. And so that's something that is another kind of revenue stream. And then some of the other things is like creating like meditation scripts. So kind of like more of a passive where people can download for just a few dollars, like meditation scripts they could use in their yoga classes or as therapists and things like that. And then most recently I became an author, which is a new revenue stream. So I have two books, one on incorporating meditation and mindfulness into the family system. And another one is a book and guided meditation journal for anxiety. So that's a newer one, but a lot of the things that I'm doing to monetize and to have revenue streams outside of, I do still do a few events a month here locally in the Twin Cities and maybe like one retreat a year, maybe two, are things that I can do on my own time and then kind of share them either passively or have really specific hours in which I do something. Because I found that when I had kids, since my job is more flexible, that means that for example, we had a week where we were just my husband wasn't able to do it, but I was. And so having these revenue streams where, I can batch a podcast or I can, schedule a babysitter for a few hours to go do an event or spend a day writing meditation scripts and then slowly, releasing them, working on writing a book before the kids wake up during nap time and after bedtime hours. Like I think when we think about quote, like full-time or full-time yoga teaching, we have a really specific image in our mind as to what that looks like, which is usually teaching a bunch of classes and, running to different places, different studios, racking up all these like class hours. But that's just not my experience, especially after having kids. Is a lot of time my full-time quote hours are outside of being a mom. And then I share that content at a different date when I can. So I can still be consistent. It's just really hard for me to commit to like regular studio classes at this time. So I don't do a lot of that right now.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And that kind of brings me to next question that, you do have kids and you have two children and you're also working as a yoga teacher. And some of my listeners have asked me like, how can you, a full-time yoga teacher, can balance teaching yoga as your career and your income, but also balance being a mom? For example, many of the yoga teacher that's kind of famous or making it in our eyes, they don't have kids. Not all. I'm not saying all of them don't, but many of them don't. And it's maybe easier to really 100% invest everything into your career when you don't have family to also take care of. So how are you able to balance your teaching career and putting time and effort into building your business, but also having two child and also taking care of them and being a mom? I think that's something I know some of my listeners have asked me, how can they find that balance? Because they're also finding it difficult to find that balance of like how much to invest in building my teaching career and also with how much time to invest into my family.
And you know what? I think it is hard. It's hard. I just want to say that off the bat, no matter where you're at, how you slice it, it is hard. There's two different things that come to mind. One is I always talk about this like pizza, it's kind of this pizza analogy. So the amount of effort and time that you have to give in your day anywhere is like a pizza. It's a finite thing. There's this one pizza and whatever, there's 8 slices. At times, and if you think about all the different areas of your life, your work, your friendships, your romantic relationships, your family, whatever that looks like, your own self-care, a side hustle, everything in your life has to eat from this same pizza. And often what happens is you give those slices of pizza away to everyone else. And then you're like, okay, now I'm just hungry. There's nothing left for me. And when you have children, in my experience, you just have more people eating from that same pizza. So often it feels like, it's 7:00 in the morning and I'm like, oh my gosh, my kids have already taken 3/4 of this pizza. I need to quick eat something before it's all gone. Or, there's nothing left for my business. And I've had to be a little bit more strategic as to when I shifted my mindset to like this pizza of like what I have to give is finite. It is not infinite. I want it to be infinite. But I can only give so much in one day. And then the next day, I get another pizza. And so recognizing that there will be ebbs and flows. So I was definitely full time. Like when I was building my business before kids, I was working just like nonstop. And I just had this like incredible stamina and was always traveling, doing all these things, investing everything into my business, watching it grow. And so much of that pizza was going to my work. And then I had kids. And one of the biggest struggles I had when I had my son, who on the internet, I just call him Pork Chop. It's not his legal name, but that's like his like internet alias. But I had Pork Chop, and now there was this other person needing a big chunk of my pizza. And I just had to work less. I know this is the full-time yoga teacher podcast, but I had to really recognize that there would be ebbs and flows. And then as he got a little bit earlier, all of a sudden there's, a little bit more pizza to put back into my business. And then I had my second child, and that, cycle kind of repeated itself, and realizing that there's ebbs and flows. And I had to start focusing on kind of, sounds cliche, but like working smarter, not harder. And so realizing I only had so much I could give, so many hours to give. And so I started looking at, I'm a big numbers person. I feel like the data doesn't lie. So I track everything. I have this thing called the social tracker, where every week I put podcast downloads, YouTube metrics, email list, Pinterest views, insight time, everything that I'm doing. I track the metrics every single week. And I also every single month break down every revenue stream and exactly how much it made. And I looked back at, the last 6 to 12 months of data, and I look at what's working at the end of every year. I look at the previous 12 months. I go, based on the numbers, what is working? And I do more of what is working, and then I do less of what is not working. And I try to take my emotion and my ego out of it and make decisions based on that. Because if I only have so much time and effort to give into something, if I'm like, okay, like right now for me, pop-up events are really working. I only do like 1 to 2 a month. I'm having a lot of fun with them. They're performing well. So maybe that's something I explore doing more for next year. And I just try to let the data speak for itself, and release projects that even if they're special to my heart, if they're not working, maybe I revisit them later or I release them. But when I realized that there are more people eating from my pizza, I just had to be a little bit more strategic as to where I put my effort. And I'm now putting my effort into kind of going from working a bunch of jobs and teaching a few yoga classes. It was such a dream of mine to be teaching full time. And now it's a dream of mine to start teaching part time, but to keep the revenue and the following and everything that I had from full time, but to be able to do it on a part time schedule so that I can feel like I am both cultivating my business baby and being there the way I want to be for my actual babies. And so I think recognizing that things change as your life changes, different ebbs and flows, and that it is hard and that you can't do it all, but you can do your best to be strategic to do what you can. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. There's a lot of great golden nuggets in what you just shared. I really love what you said about the keeping track of your data. And I think that's so important for me too. Since I started teaching from the week one of my teaching yoga career, I always tracked like how much money I'm making from each class and, which studio and also how much money I'm spending. And so it's actually beautiful to be able to see from my year 1, year 2, year 3, all my income, where it's coming from. And it feels great to see the number growing every year. And also working smarter, like what you said, like in the beginning, I was just teaching as many studio classes as possible to make enough money to live. And now I'm able to reduce the number of classes I teach, but then still continue to increase my income. But without seeing my data, I wouldn't have known that strategy is working. So yeah, definitely. I think it's so important to kind of have that reflection. And like you said, data doesn't lie. So important to, I think, keep track. That's something I also teach in my mentorship. It's like, just keep track of how much money you're making, how much money you're spending, so you know how much money can you invest in your business or can you invest in your continuing education. I think those are so important. And I love that your goal is to kind of move more part-time, working less hours per week, but then maintaining that revenue. And I think that's amazing. And that is going to be also, like you said, you get to spend more time with your family and your kids that way. So I love that goal that you have and the direction you're trying to take your business into. And another question that came from this, what you just shared, is, did you ever have or invest in like business coaching or business training? There's a lot of training for yoga teachers out there these days, and I guess business coaches. And is that something you also invested to kind of be good at what you're doing now? Because it seems like you are very savvy with your business and knowing your numbers and like making goals according to where you're at.
I never did. I actually only this year, and it just started this month, made my first, so like a decade in, made my first like real big investment in some kind of like a business growth thing. And it's really about kind of like building funnels. It's a really robust kind of year-long process, and like taking some of the like this like meditation teacher training and just making it better, how to, fill it more, like things like that. But I never invested in anything like that because I couldn't afford it. Especially being single income, it was always any little scrap left over at the end of the day went into my family's bank account, and we just needed it. And so I was never really in a place to invest in like coaching. And I think there's definitely two different tracks where you can put a lot of money up front and do a lot of investing in that from the get-go, and maybe it will accelerate your success in the beginning. But I also wouldn't change the way that I did it, which is kind of just like bootstrapping and DIYing it the whole way, because I learned so much and I acquired so many skills through the having to do it on my own and wanting to kind of cut corners everywhere, not cut corners, but not leak any money anywhere because we so desperately needed it, because I made a commitment to myself that I would only follow this dream as long as it was still responsible to my family. And I would never ask my family to, sacrifice or live with less than they deserved because of my dream. Like I knew I could always maybe circle back to it. And so if I ever felt like, my family was suffering because I was trying to continue something that just wasn't working, that I would walk away from it and, pursue a more traditional path. Thankfully, that's never happened, but it's always been a commitment in my heart. And it's something that, I will follow through on if I ever need to. But I was really motivated by that, being like, I don't want to leave my dream. I don't want to, return to working in management. I love what I'm doing and I want to find a way to make it work. And so I never really invested anything into my business at all because I needed every little last bit of profit left over to support my family.
Thank you for sharing that. I love hearing that because I also been too hesitant. Those business coaches or, those trainings are quite
really expensive.
Yeah, really expensive. There's a
and I've
high
heard really
investment in
mixed
that.
reviews. I think it's about finding like the right person. You need to feel like you have a good, and everyone will promise you that they're going to fix all of your problems for $15,000 or whatever it is. And maybe that's true, but also I don't know if you necessarily need that per se. Like it took me a decade to be like, okay, I feel like in this one particular area, I've kind of hit a ceiling. Like I feel like everything that I've learned from DIYing it, now I need to invest in learning more in something. But I don't know. I've always found it really satisfying too, to figure out how to do things on my own. Maybe it's just because I'm like neurodivergent that I do things a little bit differently. But yeah, I personally have never really made a lot of those big investments, especially in the beginning.
Yeah. And I think it's good for me and listeners to hear and know that it is possible, that you don't have to invest that much money into a business coach to make your career grow or thrive. Because I think from outsider watching you and your business, I feel like you've done such an amazing job building it. And like you said, you were supporting your family with a single income. That's hard to do. And also with a career in yoga, I feel like most people I interview, and from my own experience, that yoga is not an easy career path to earn a lot of money. And a lot of us do it because we love it. And it's not to say it's not wrong to be earning a lot of money. It's not wrong to want to earn a lot of money because we are putting in a lot of work and we're doing what we love. And I think it's so great to see you as an example of somebody who actually were able to do that. And then also hearing that you didn't really have to invest your thousands and thousands of dollars into a business coach, but you actually kind of figured it out and did it on your own. And I think it's a good example for all of us to hear. So thank you.
Yeah. I think the best investment you can make at the beginning is just your time and learning and like tenacity and being like, oh, I need a website. So I'm just going to, if you have the time. When I was building my business, again, my husband was always in school. I lived in a place where I didn't know I had a lot of time on I had no money, but I had a lot of time on my hands. And I felt like that was what I was really investing, was like my time, before my other jobs, after my jobs, on the weekends, all of that. Like that's what I really invested, was my time into learning how to do these things and to get better at what I was doing.
Yeah, so true. And what does your average week of working as a full-time yoga teacher or just working in a yoga career look like for you?
Right now, that's a tough one to answer right now because especially in the summertime, anyone listening with kids, like summer is also like, a little bit different. But I would say my week, actually the way that my husband and I work is he works 7 days on, 7 days off. So we kind of alternate work weeks. So I kind of work like pretty heavily 2 weeks of the month, and then he's, working a lot 2 weeks of the month. So on my non-work weeks, I pretty much am just like mom. And then I check my email inbox and make sure there's nothing like urgent. But then on my work weeks, it is a lot of like working on podcast episodes because they're mostly guided meditations. It's like writing out the scripts, planning the topics, all of that. Writing. I mean, this, by the time you actually get to like the hitting record phase of a podcast episode, like that's just like the last little step. It's all the work that like goes into it on the back end. So it's a lot of working on the podcast. It is like repurposing content. So taking those podcast episodes, putting them on YouTube, sharing on social media, things like that. It is, maybe a pop-up event. This week I have yoga nidra and a sound bath coming up locally. It's a lot of planning and phone calls. Sometimes it's calls, like I do some mentorships as well. So it's working like one-to-one with people. But a lot of it is just getting to write and create meditations and working on, I do like office hours for people in trainings, things like that. But yeah, it is a lot of It's a lot of computer time, but I don't necessarily mind it because I love connecting with people. So it's a lot of like connecting with people from like all over via computer time. And then I record my podcast in this little closet underneath the stairs, and the light burnt out. So it's like in the dark. So it's a lot of sitting in the dark making my podcast as well, which I really love. So yes, it's a lot of writing and a lot of Zoom calls, and then some teaching and events as well.
Thank you for sharing all that. Another question I have is, do you have any advice for teachers who are maybe looking to take their teaching into more location independent teaching? I feel like, these days, digital nomads are on the rise. And now that I'm traveling and I'm also, right now living in Peru and also working online as I do in person, there's a lot more people who are really looking for a life that is location independent. It's becoming much more common and popular than before. So for other yoga teachers who are trying to shift their career teaching, or maybe want to focus their teaching or income towards more online so they can be location independent, do you have any advice or tips that you have learned along your journey?
Yes. So I think really refining your voice as a teacher. So thinking about, what you stand for, kind of creating that authentic experience for your students is really important, as well as developing some kind of a signature something. I'm not necessarily, we hear people say all the time, niche down, niche down, niche down. And like, yes, maybe, but if you're looking for something that's location independent, having a signature something. So for me, that's my signature trainings where they're between, 20 to 40 hours, and it's meditation teacher training, yoga nidra, and restorative yoga. Like those are my things. I love them. And creating some kind of a signature something. Maybe you weave sound bowls into what you're teaching. Maybe you teach kids. Maybe you teach teachers how to do safe hands-on adjustments. Like, what is something that you're so passionate about that you could just talk about forever? It doesn't necessarily have to be a training. It could be, a workshop or a signature style of class. And once you've developed kind of this signature, go out and try to hear no as many times as you can. Let people know, like, hey, I do yoga for heart health. Would you ever want me to come do a lunch and learn at your corporate office, as part of your wellness initiative for HR, whatever it is, right? Like just start putting yourself out there and really kind of building your recognition and your reputation as someone who's really good at this one thing. For me, that was the guided meditations. I always like to say I'm people's meditation like gateway drug. And I love being that, like simple, grounded down to earth practices. Like we don't need to be, going to another planet via meditation, which we certainly can. And I can help you with that too. But like my particular style, like I love having the people that are like, I don't know about meditation. Like, I don't know how to do it. I don't know where to start. My mind is too busy. I'm like, please come to me. Like, that's what I love is like the really simple, like, this is how you start a meditation practice. And this is how it can change your life really easily. And then teaching teachers some of these softer sides, but like create a signature something and then just start putting it out there, sharing content around it, pitching it to people. Try to hear no as many times as you can. Like for every 10 no's, you'll get a yes. And that yes could be the thing that would like change your life. And then as you continue to grow, you can evolve and add more things. I think we want to have the finished product before we start and be like, oh, well, I need a passive piece of revenue stream. I need a workshop. I need a course. I need an ebook. I need this. I need that. My advice would be just start with a thing. What is a topic that you know a lot about that you could teach really well, or a style that you do? Start with that one thing and create one unique product around that. And then just start really going for it. And it will grow and evolve beyond that.
Thank you for that advice. I love that. And what aspect of being a full-time teacher that do you love the most? And what do you find it most challenging?
The thing that I love the most, this sounds cliche, but it really is just like, I'm just so excited and passionate about the work that I'm doing. And I have also worked so many jobs in which I haven't felt that it really is like, I recognize what a blessing and a privilege it is to like every day get to do, even though there's like little things that are not, if someone wants to send me an email and be like, I hated this podcast episode, whatever. There's little things that you're just like, okay, that's like not my favorite part. But I mean, even the toughest stuff is still like, well, I'm having a tough time with something that I love. Like, that's amazing. And like, I make money doing what I love. Like, I support my family doing what I love. And that's just so special to me. And I really just, I never want to take that for granted, because I have also worked so many jobs where it just, I was just clocking in, clocking out, getting the paycheck. It wasn't my folding sweat towels at an Anytime Fitness wasn't, my passion. And this is. And so I feel so fortunate to do that. And honestly, I think the hardest part for me right now is juggling the time. Having the two little ones. I am the primary parent, and my work is more flexible. And so that means by default, if anything goes awry, I usually have to kind of pick up the slack for that, and I have a great partner and a supportive family, but I do the majority of the family and the kids stuff, or a lot of it. And it's just the juggle of two kids and a business baby, and feeling content with where I'm at right now. Maybe I'm not doing as much with my business as I have in the past, or I would like to in the future, but also recognizing that like these days are fleeting, and I am putting in the amount of effort and time that I would like with my children, and finding kind of that contentment within myself that I probably don't have the time and effort to fully cultivate both. So sometimes I have to make those tough decisions. And I think that's the hardest part right now is the juggle of both. I do my best, but I do chronically feel behind, where I'm just like, I could just use a few days to like catch up. But then also I don't want a few days to catch up, because I like hanging out with my kids, and I like being able to casually be like, hey, let's go to the splash pad. I think that's the hard part for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and like your honesty and trying to find contentment in what is, and with that, like trying to juggle being a mom and also having such a thriving yoga business online. So thank you for sharing that. And what does success mean to you?
Success to me is something that I think is found within. Does everyone say they feel like their answers are cliche to this? Because it's hard to answer this question, because I've definitely had many different goals over my career where I felt like, oh, if I, reach this number of downloads, or, oh, if I have, this many people come on a retreat, or make this amount of revenue in a year, that maybe, or became an author, that then I would feel like I had hit success. But that isn't necessarily the case. I found that those are just like really amazing goals, and it feels fantastic to reach those goals. But for me, success is when I like look inward and I feel good and excited about the work that I'm doing. And I feel like I run my business and my business doesn't run me. And I think for a long time, I felt like my business was kind of running me. And I was like just an employee for my own business, instead of being like, no, this is like my business. I get to be in charge. I get to decide what that looks like, what I want to pursue, how many hours I want to do, what I want to do, and make those decisions. Success just feels so internal for me, and feeling like I am happy and fulfilled with what I'm doing, and that I'm doing the best that I can, and that I'm proud of the work that I'm doing. That's what success is. And everything else is just like a goal that I'm striving to achieve.
Thank you for sharing that. I love what you said, that the business is not running you, but you're running the business. I don't know if it was the exact quote you said, but I love what you said that, because something I've noticed during the pandemic, I took a lot of my teaching online, and I would say like half of what I do is online, other half is in person. And I love that. But that came with also a lot of back end computer work that I have to do that I didn't have to previously when I was only teaching in person. And although I love having my own online business, sometimes I feel like it's almost like it's controlling my life as well, So just like being grateful that I can have this online business, and I have this online income that I can rely on, and being able to offer yoga in a slightly different way than just in person. But then also finding that balance of like, this business is also not running my life. How can I find that balance? So thank you for sharing that, because it comes with independence, right? Like it comes with independence of like, well, now I don't have to rely on this yoga studio that I work for or other company that I work for. Now I have my own business. I can actually earn my own income without being reliant on other company or being employee of other company, which is such a beautiful thing and brings so much independence. And I love that. But then there's also a part that okay, now I have all this other, the admin work, or the people relying on me, email that I have to write back. and finding that balance of like, okay, how can this business and this lifestyle benefit me and work for me, not only me being controlled by it. So yeah, definitely a balance. I'm figuring it out on my own as well. So thank you for sharing that. And another question I have is you have mentioned a little bit of goal or the vision you have for your business moving forward of how you wanted to reduce it to part-time but still keep the same revenue or income. Is there any other goals or vision or a dream that you have for your business in the future, where it's going, where it's headed?
I would like to continue to help support people. Like one thing that I have kind of been bopping around in the back of my head is, and this isn't necessarily in the yoga space, and one thing that I will say is when you're growing a business, always keep a door open to surprising new opportunities. Even if you think like, oh, this isn't necessarily in the yoga space, so maybe I shouldn't pursue it. Trust your gut. And like, there's been so many twists and turns in my path. Like when I first started teaching online, I thought, oh, I'm going to be an online like vinyasa yoga teacher. And what I'm doing now is so different. It feels so great and so fulfilling. And I think part of that is because I always was open to new ideas or being like, that's interesting. That intrigues me and looking into it. So one thing on like the yoga side that I want to do is I want to, right now, my meditation teacher training, it's a virtual option that you can be done at your own pace. I'm really proud of that course. And then my other two signature ones, because I'm not traveling as much, I haven't been able to teach it as much. So I want to take Yoga Nidra teacher training and turn it into a virtual done at your own pace component. I feel so passionately about Yoga Nidra and teaching people how to teach that. That's one thing that I want to do professionally and, kind of create that. But something that's been a goal of mine that's been sitting in the back of my head is I've actually been thinking about creating a podcast network of female independent podcasters, specifically kind of in like the wellness spirituality space. I think just because, and I want to help foster and grow and support independent podcasters, like women in that space. And that's something that I don't know if it's a soon thing, but it's something that I envision kind of creating like the anti-network where I think sometimes when people do join a podcast network, they feel like they lose a lot of autonomy over their show. I think of it more as kind of like a collective, like a way that we could help support one another, and I could help kind of mentor and help female independent podcasters reach their full potential. And that's something that I've really been, I don't know what it looks like yet, but it's something that I think I would like to pursue down the road and help other people like monetize their podcast and, help us support one another, because it can be tough to podcast, and it can feel kind of isolating too, because you're creating it all on your own. And I would love to help build a community specifically in the independent female wellness podcasting space. So I think that's something, it's not yoga related, but it is something that's been on my mind for a little bit.
I love that idea, and I would be very, very interested in that whenever you offer that.
Well, I will let you know when that dream starts to become a reality, but I'm still figuring out what that would look like. But there's been a couple of times, you can feel free to take this part out if you'd like, if it's not relevant to like your show, but there's been a couple of times I've made a lot of really great friends in podcasting, and I love chatting with other podcasters, but there's been a couple of times where we've even done kind of not even networking, but just sort of like almost like a virtual happy hour with like other podcasters, and everyone brings like one thing that's working well and one thing that they're struggling with. And then we all kind of talk about these things. We're like, oh, I had that problem, and then I tried this. And then we kind of just like swap like tips and what's working or not working, or even just to be like, my numbers have been down this month too. And then someone's like, oh, I heard it was a update on this. Like, it just felt so good and so refreshing the few times that I've done that I want to create that kind of more in like a more like official space. But anyways, you can take that part out if it's not relevant. But I think it's just nice to have community in that way.
Yeah, I actually would love that. If you do any other those kind of group meetup, I would love to join, because I've been to few like yoga teachers meetup that's done online or in person, or talking about our yoga business. How can I, these are challenges I'm coming up with, and these are things that's working for me. And I think it'll be great to have that kind of chat and space with other podcaster would be really amazing for me. And I think it's also very beneficial as well for other podcasters. So definitely I'll be interested in that whenever you offer that.
Amazing. I love that.
So tell us a little bit. I mean, we're almost coming to an end, but I want you to share a little bit about the two books that you have published and what that book is about and how people can find that book and purchase that book.
Oh, thank you for letting me share that. Something that I felt really excited and proud of more recently was becoming an author. It was something that I felt like was really unattainable, especially having both ADHD and dyslexia. When I was younger, I struggled to learn to read. And so it's something that I feel really proud of. I call my two little book babies. And so I have one book that's called Meditation for the Modern Family. That was the first book that I wrote. It was published in September, so about a year or so ago. And it is all about how you can weave meditation into the family system for all ages. So it has everything from like prenatal, like you're pregnant, all the way to like teenagers, and then like how you as a parent or an adult can use meditation to kind of be your best self in a way or show up as the parent that you want to. It's broken into these different topics like anxiety, insomnia, courage, joy, all sorts of things that pop up. And so that's something, if anyone is a parent or becoming a parent, you might find to be a really useful resource. I also have heard a lot of yoga teachers actually that have really been enjoying that book, even if they don't have kids, because every single topic, and there's like 35 of them, 35 chapters, has guided practices as mantras for that topic and guided practices for little ones, adolescents, adults, and teens. So there's a lot of really good resources for like, if you personally want to teach like kids meditation, or you teach like adolescents, things like that, tons of practices in there for those age groups. So I've heard a lot of yoga teachers, they appreciate that book as well if they teach younger ones. And then my second book is called You Are Not Your Thoughts. And it is an 8-week book and guided journal for meditation and anxiety. So the first half is kind of meditation 101, how meditation can rewire your brain for smaller anxiety responses, all of that kind of meditation, anxiety 101. And the second half of the book is this really beautiful guided journal. The illustrator that I work with, she's also a mom, but she's so talented. And each week has a different theme. So like recognizing your anxiety, working with the physiological responses of anxiety, your thoughts, your feelings, all these things. And every day has a guided meditation practice, a different journal prompt, and then a mantra for the day. That came out just at the beginning of this year. And I'm really proud of that one as well. So any of my anxious girlies out there, journalers, you may love that one. And you can get it anywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, all the places.
Amazing. Sounds like such a great books and helpful. The first one, especially if you have family and kids, I think that's such a wonderful book to have. So thank you for sharing that. And is there any questions that I missed or I haven't asked yet, but wanting to share to the listeners?
I don't think so. I've loved chatting and answering all of these questions. If anyone listening has any specific questions, like I answer my DMs on Instagram, or you can, send me an email. But yeah, no, I've just loved chatting with you.
Me too. I feel like you offered so many great tips and advices, but also just like hearing other yoga teachers' journey, I think is so important. And that's why I started this podcast, is because I think it's so inspiring to see other yoga teachers who's been doing this for many years, who's actually been doing it well and have this amazing business or this teaching career that we look up to. And as a newer yoga teacher, I think it's so important to have somebody to look up to that's kind of walk the path that you want to walk on. And another unique thing about being a yoga teacher is that everybody has such a different, unique path. And I think the path and the journey that you share today is so valuable. And I'm sure a lot of listeners will be very inspired from it as well. So thank you so much. Can you tell the listener how they can find you, or like any website, social media, where they can find you, as well as if you have any upcoming offering that you want to share?
Oh, thank you. So starting at my website, yogaforyouonline.com. That's where you can find everything: the podcasts, links to the books, meditation teacher training, retreats, all of that stuff is there. So you can definitely start there. And if you don't find what you're looking for, send me a DM on Instagram. My handle is Yoga for You Online, so FOR. And my podcast is called Mindful in Minutes. And then I have a secondary one called Meditation Mama, which is for anyone in the fertility, prenatal, or postpartum stage of their life. And so you can find a lot of guided meditation practices. I would love to see you over there. Otherwise, That's it. I'm just so grateful to be able to share this space with you. And I'm grateful for everyone tuning in and listening, and leave a 5-star review on this podcast. Let our girl know how amazing she's doing. Share it with a friend. Do all of that. Hype her up.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for saying that. And I really appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed this conversation today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation I had with Kelly. She had so many great tips and a lot of amazing learning experiences she had from her journey of creating this career before podcast was a big thing, before online offering was a big thing. She's been doing this for such a long time and building this amazing yoga business on her own. So I really have a huge respect for her. And I hope you also enjoyed this conversation that I had with Kelly. Few reminders is that if you have questions you would like to send me for the next 40th episode of the Full-Time Yoga Teacher podcast, I would love to receive some questions for this podcast episode. So send me questions either on my Instagram at Reika Yoga or through my website www.reikayoga.com. Just go to contact page and send me a message of questions that you would like me to talk about or answer in the next episode. I would really love to hear from you. So that is it for now, and I'll speak to you next week.